Welcome back to the history class. I want to make this quick video in order to address the integration of quotes, as the majority of the written assignments require you to do this. So quickly, I titled this PowerPoint "How to Write Like a Historian," the use of academic sources and the implementation of quotes. So as historians, we need to use primary sources and secondary sources to justify our arguments. And I want you to do this in our class because even though you might not be a historian or a history major, this is something that's used across the board. So even if you take sociology, anthropology, biology, mostly any field will use something like this when it comes to writing their essays. So just to go over a few quick objectives. Number one, I want to provide you some examples of historical writing, just to show you this is what historians do. Number two, explain the integration of quotes, explain why we do this. You have a few activities that require you to do this already, but sometimes explaining it might help a little bit better rather than reading just in a PDF file. And show you also show you some examples of how people analyze the evidence, analyze the quotes. So it's not just about, filling your paper with quotes and assume that the quote is going to speak for you, but rather using selective quotes and providing insight as to why you're using those quotes. How do those quotes help support your argument? So quickly, I want to show you some example of sources. As historians, we are dependent on primary and secondary sources. Down here, you have artwork. Artwork can be considered a primary source, but for the purposes of this course, we're not going to focus too much on that. Well, maybe there'll be an activity that does art analysis, but I really want you to focus on primary and secondary sources. So a primary source is written by somebody who is alive during the particular era that you're writing about. So if you're writing about the 1960s and you're writing about the civil rights movement, something like Martin Luther King's speech, which he gave at that time, could be considered a primary source. Here you see an example of the letters of Gregory of Tours, where he was alive during the what we call the Merovingian period in the Middle Ages, and this 6th century, and he's writing about things he encountered at that time. Obviously, as a historian, I was not there, so I really don't know what happened. So using primary sources, somebody who is alive at that time, helps me understand what took place. Again, we cannot just completely accept their word for it because they have their own biases. And then over here, we have a secondary source. Secondary sources are done by historians, such as myself. But here's just an example of a book that writes about the same period that this person is alive at during this time. And this is a historian who's writing about the two important queens in the 6th century. So a person like myself who writes history uses primary sources to write about a period that I was not around to witness myself. Okay, so that's the difference between primary and secondary sources. Depending on the activity, we'll be using primary sources or possibly secondary sources. For the majority of my classes, we're dependent on the textbook, so we'll more than likely use secondary sources. So why do we need to quote from these sources, right? Well, first, like any field, we need evidence, right? So if we're writing about a historical period, we need evidence from that period to tell us what was taking place. So as its kind of basic foundation, quotes help us provide evidence of what was taking place at that moment. Number two, as a historian, we're not just writing a history for the sake of writing a history, like this happened, that happened, then this other thing happened, right? We are actually making arguments. So by using evidence, by using direct quotes, it helps us legitimize our argument. In addition to legitimizing our argument, it helps us provide analysis like I said earlier, many of these primary sources are biased. They have their own goal, their own agenda. Not that they're lying, but we need to be critical of them. So by using direct quotes, we can show the reader, here's the quote, but then provide some insight as to what the quote is saying. And then lastly, it helps explain why the quote is important to your argument. So like I said, we're not just writing a series of events like a timeline. We are making an argument. So you have to ask yourself, why am I using this specific quote, right? Why is it important to the argument that I want to get across? A lot of these points are addressed in the Art of Quoting PDF file that I have you all look at. But again, I just want to reiterate some of the major points that it makes, because this is what we do as historians. So let's look at some examples of historical writing. The first one comes from one of my former students, and I'll give you an example of a professional historian, but the first two will be from previous students, and kind of explain to you what they do correctly. And this is what I want you to do for our class. So this first example is about this idea called welfare capitalism. It focuses in the 1920s. Basically, companies are trying to keep out unions at this time. So it says, unemployment was always a threat that was just around the corner for many workers, even with these benefits. So they never felt secured. And lastly, the ultimate goal of implementing welfare capitalism was really to eliminate unions at the workshop. So welfare capitalism was about, quote, sustaining a power system that granted management full authority over the terms of employment, unquote. Then it has a citation. Companies were not really concerned with the welfare of their workers, but rather used these benefits to rein in their control of them. So in this example, you can see how the student starts the sentence and kind of very smoothly weaves the quote into their idea. It almost reads like a complete sentence, right? So this is something that I want you to do. As historians, this is what we do, right? We're using evidence, which is a quote, and we're integrating it smoothly with our voice. Then the second part provides the analysis about how companies are using this concept called welfare capitalism, really not to help the worker, but really just to control the terms of employment. So this is a great example of how you integrate a quote, but then also do part 4 and part 5 of the Art of Quoting assignment. Here's another example. This is more of a first-person narrative. Sometimes I have you do assignments as though you're alive in a particular time in history. This is a really great example. It says, when we arrived in New York, we saw the splendor of the urban jungle and all that it had to offer. Trolleys took us, quote, to and from work, unquote, but on weekends we flocked to Coney Island where we could, quote, socialize, compete in carnival games, and listen to band concerts, offering us an inexpensive opportunity to mingle with the opposite sex away from the prying eyes of our families and neighborhoods, unquote, and has the citation. We felt free to do what we wanted, no longer worrying of what others might think of our behavior or our reputation. In this example, is talking about when Coney Island first came about. But again, you could see how the student has their voice right here in this first sentence. They continue in their voice, and they very smoothly integrate different parts of this quote, right? They have a small section, but they also have a substantial quote down here. I mean, it's almost 3 lines here. And it's just integrated so smoothly from their voice to that of the quote. They did have to make some changes because sometimes quotes are not perfect, right? They're not written in the same tense that we're writing in. So as you can see, they have some brackets here because they had to change not the meaning of the quote, but just the tense of the quote. So I believe the original quote said offered and inexpensive, something like that. And you could see how it flows with their voice. They put offering us an inexpensive, right? So I want you to keep in mind of doing things like that. So the quote flows from your voice into the quote. And then the last sentence, this is the analysis, right? This quote, well, what is this quote telling me, telling the reader? Well, it's really about Coney Island giving young teenagers at the during the 1900s this sense of freedom to do whatever they want without feeling like their reputation will be ruined because of their behavior. This big issue back then. So again, there's another example. And then the last example comes from the historian from that book that was on the previous page called The Dark Queens. She writes, once the bishops were seated, King Chilperic charged Praxiteles not only with violating the church's incest prohibitions by presiding over the marriage of his rebel son and Brunhild, but also with actively trying to overthrow him. Quote, you actually gave gifts and urged Merovic to kill me, unquote, Chilperic accused the old bishop. Gregory's is the only witness account that survives, and he is adamantly biased, but he described a show trial of witnesses bribed or cowed into cooperating. So again, you can see how the author provides their voice, then has the quote, but again, it's integrated into their voice, goes from the quote into their voice smoothly. And as you can see, they have brackets there because they needed to add the name of the person that's being accused here. So, this kind of, doesn't change the quote, the meaning of the quote, but just adds a little bit more context, which, the one up here does the same thing. And then the last sentence, gives us the analysis. Gregory wasn't the only person there, but he is the only source that we have that survived, the 1300 years, or maybe 1400 years. But really, the analysis is right here. What he describes is really a show trial, right? This is what this quote is kind of telling the reader. So I hope these examples help you and also explains to you why I want you to use direct quotes, right? As historians, it's important for us to use direct evidence from the readings to support the points that we want to get across, and also to integrate it smoothly, right? You just don't want to insert a bunch of quotes and have the quotes speak for you. There's a reason why you have that quote in there. You have to explain that reason. Again, going back to the art of quoting assignment. So let's conclude this quick lecture on how to use quotes. So what we covered here is first, what's the difference between primary and secondary source? For the most part, again, you'll be fine using, the textbook. That's probably what I will require you to use. There will be instances where we might use a primary source, but that will be provided for you. So all the sources to completing the assignments will be provided, will be either in the textbook or provided for you. So keep that in mind. The instructions should make that fairly clear. The last point that I want to address is the why quotes are important in historical writing. So as I stated earlier, that quotes give us the evidence that we need to justify our arguments. It's also important not to use too little of a quote. If you ever look at a movie review, like a commercial, and it says, greatest film ever, right? If you actually read the entire review, it probably says something really bad. But the person who made the commercial uses just a little bit of the quote to make it seem like it's better than what it is. This could be very problematic if you use too little of a quote. So don't use maybe 3 or 4 words of a quote and think that's going to provide the full context of what the section is saying, because I do go in there and actually check your references, which is why I need you to cite it. Also, don't go too crazy, as I said earlier, quoting entire paragraphs of the book. You want to be concise and use enough information to justify your argument. I provided those examples, and those have a good amount of information. There might be I don't know the word count, maybe 20 words or something like that of a quote, but it all depends on what you're writing. So again, you don't want to use too little, you don't want to go overboard and use an entire page of the book to justify it, because then it sounds like you're just repeating what the book says. You're not really providing any analysis. So keep that in mind. If you ever have any questions, feel free to send me an email.